As an artist and a writer on the internet, I've seen a lot of people take inspiration from one another. It's usually fine, but there's inevitably going to be those cases where you have to do a double take on whether or not it's just inspiration. I've also seen a lot of theft. I've even experienced it myself. You know, somewhere where people have both been inspired by my work and directly traced over it, I'd like to think I have a pretty good grasp on this topic as a whole. Anytime there's obvious theft, there's always backlash, and there's never a debate. Not this time though. Because of the debate regarding today's topic, it begs the question, is Palworld just a Pokemon clone? Palworld is an action, adventure, and survival game, and if you've heard of it, you've definitely heard the term Pokemon with guns. In the game, you catch creatures called Pals, which are elemental creatures, and to catch them, you use Pal spheres, and you can either use your own Pals to battle them, or you can, If I can be honest, I'm surprised at how popular it is. I saw a total of one YouTube ad and that's it. No more than that one ad that played for me once, no talk on social media, no articles, no anything. I just immediately thought that it was going to be like a trashy mobile app that would ultimately just disappear into nothing because it's stupid. But a few days after I got that first ad, it's everywhere. I'd say I have no idea how it got this popular without any lead up, but let's be honest, we all know why. One look at the ad and I went, that's just Pokemon with guns. I've been a Pokemon fan for basically as long as I can remember, so I'm very familiar with Pokemon's art style and designing conventions. That said, my sister, who has much less Pokemon experience than me, just so happened to be in the room with me when that ad was playing, and she took one look at that ad and went, that's just Pokemon with guns. In fact, most of what I've heard about it is comparing it to Pokemon. Even when two games have similarities, there's still usually enough to set them apart as two different series. And seeing as Pokemon is the world's highest grossing franchise, is it really a problem if a game copies it? And just how much does Palworld take from Pokemon? I'm going to talk about more than just the creature designs in Palworld, and I also wanted to see gameplay-wise how similar it is to Pokemon, but since the designs are most of what people are talking about, I figured this is the best place to start. I'm sure a lot of you have seen a lot of the creature designs at this point, more specifically the more questionable ones, but I would highly encourage you to watch this section of the video anyway, because there's a lot to talk about here, both good and bad. While I'm very familiar with the entire Pokedex as far as designs are concerned, I wasn't at all familiar with the PAL deck. I've seen comparisons online, but I really wanted to go through all of them myself. When it comes to comparing certain PALs to Pokemon, there were some that I agreed with, but there were also situations where I thought, I think that looks more like this Pokemon, or even comparing it to this Pokemon is a bit of a stretch. So I spent a long time going through the PAL deck of 111 PALs and sorting through each PAL into 3 different categories. The first is original designs, and I'm sure you can figure out what that means. The second is Pokemon-inspired designs. I'll talk about my criteria for how I decided this when we get there. And the last, of course, is stolen designs. While I'm sure you can imagine what that means, I want to give a quick disclaimer. At any point in this video, when I say stolen, blatant theft, plagiarism, or anything along those lines, that is my personal opinion. Nothing has been decided in a court of law, and I strongly advise you to look at all of the designs for yourselves and come to your own conclusions. That said, let's start with the original designs since we can get through those the fastest. I'll start with a slow scroll of the designs I don't have much to say about. If I went through each of these individually, my commentary would just be, yep, that's an original design. And it would get very repetitive and annoying. There's surprisingly a lot to talk about in comparison to Pokemon when it comes to some of the original designs though, but these are the ones that I think are original through and through. And if you feel like any of these are Pokemon inspired or stolen, I think I know why, but we will get to that later. There are some designs that I thought were original in nature, but have a similar inspiration for the design. These ones have been compared to Pokemon, but I honestly disagree with them. Things like a Firefox, a deer with giant antlers, and queen bee creatures aren't things exclusive to Pokemon, and since the execution is very different, I don't think it's fair to call these copies. There are even ones like an electric horse slash zebra that have a more specific inspiration. I still feel like the execution was unique. And next, there's designs that made me think of Pokemon, but ultimately decided they were original designs. The similarities between these and Pokemon were more smaller details, so I came to the conclusion that I most likely noticed these because I'm a Pokemon fan. And if I point them out, you'll probably notice them, but there's nothing big enough to really take a major note of. And lastly, there's the ones that were so close to being put in inspired designs but decided against it. Like the last group, I decided I noticed the similarities because I'm very familiar with Pokemon, but I think these ones are more obvious examples of what I mean. Who Creates has the same concept as the Murkrow line and has design elements similar to both Murkrow's line and Hoot Hoot. And like the Murkrow line, it's also a dark type. Van Weem and Ragnahawk were almost put into the inspired group since they reminded me so much of Yveltal and Galarian Zapdos respectively. And lastly, the one that made me almost lose my mind, Reptyro. When I first laid eyes on it, I immediately thought, I've seen this Pokemon before, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And after looking through the entire Pokedex twice, I couldn't find anything similar enough to feel like it was copied or inspired. The closest I got was Terrakion, but I didn't feel comfortable enough making that comparison or saying that it was copied. And after thinking about it, I think Reptyro is the perfect example of why almost every design feels like a Pokemon ripoff, even the ones that don't really deserve it. The Pokemon style is very identifiable, but also incredibly specific. And when I say style, I mean both the art style and Pokemon's design sense. When Pokemon are designed, they're both simple enough to be read clearly and something that can appeal to a variety of age ranges, and complex enough to be distinct and unique. It's a very hard balance to find, but at this point, the Pokemon Company has it down to a science. And when it comes to things like faces and bird feet and tufts of fur and stuff like that, there's so many ways to stylize them in both a cartoony and realistic way. The Pokemon art style takes the design goals in mind very well and stylizes things in a way that is simple but distinct. This applies to both individual aspects like tail shapes and ear shapes, but also the Pokemon as a whole when it comes to creating a strong silhouette. There's a million and one ways to stylize basically any part of a creature design, and yet most of the original designs in Palworld are leaning so hard into the Pokemon style. It's honestly a shame since I think a lot of these original designs are cool and could really stand out, but instead they're being overshadowed by the fact that they're hiding in a Pokemon art style, which makes people write them off as a cheap copy. Then again, if they made a more original art style, then they'd face the issue of them not matching the art style of stolen designs. All in all, out of the 111 pals in the game, I counted 31 designs I'm at least mostly confident in saying are original. I'm sure a lot of you watching this video have seen both inspired and stolen designs, so I'm gonna get through these as fast as I can, but I also want to say, my god, there's a lot to talk about, even some that I don't think people are talking about too much. For the inspired designs, I was looking for some specific things. If it had elements from multiple Pokemon and or having a similar inspiration that went in a similar design direction, it would get put in this category. I also looked at the types of the Pokemon compared to the types of the pals. This is more of just like a little added cherry on top, but if a Pokemon and a pal looked very visually similar and had a similar type, it's definitely something to make me question it a little. These are the ones where I don't think they're stolen per se, but a comparison is definitely fair. And to be completely clear, there's nothing wrong with being inspired by Pokemon with creature designs. And if anything, I wanted to highlight these pals to illustrate that you can be heavily inspired by something while not taking directly from them. Some of these I've seen labeled as stolen designs, and I think that's another example of why leaning into the Pokemon art style was a poor choice. Because when you're inspired by design elements and mimic the art style, it gives the first impression of being a cheap copy regardless of how different the actual game or designs may be. Flack was a little hard to place for me. It feels very Pokemon inspired, mostly because the beak and the feet look basically identical to Psyduck's. I also get some Frogadier vibes, and like both of them, it's also a water type. And Ruby has a lot of similarities to Deerling, but ultimately feels like its own creature. Gumoss is like a combination of Seedot and Clodsire, but not in a way that's overbearing, and it's also a ground type. Vixie is clearly inspired by Eevee, and the tail and fluff around the neck are especially similar. They're also both normal neutral types. Depresso has Esper vibes with very similar body shapes, but it feels different enough. The tail was a very familiar shape to me, but I couldn't quite place what Pokemon I've seen it on before, so it can live here in the inspired section for now. I also struggled where to put Fuddler since the model looks almost identical to Drillbur. Because of that alone, I almost put it in the stolen design section, but I figured if I viewed the models and designs separately, then the design itself was unique enough to go here. And don't worry, we're going to talk about the models later. Like Drillbur, it's also a ground type. Celeray is like a combo of Mantine and Mantike, but aside from being in the Pokemon art style, it's distinct enough from both of them. Toko has a different design overall from Natu and Xatu, but with similar inspirations and basically the same color palette, it's hard to say that it wasn't inspired directly from them. I think Cinnamoth is a pretty good example of drawing inspirations without being a carbon copy. It looks like it drew from Beautifly, Mothim, Butterfree, and that Score Bunny fluff the Palworld devs love to use. species. Overall, it doesn't look like any of them too much, and it feels like its own creature. Galeclaw looks a lot like Articuno and Mega Pidgeot. I think this is another instance of me being a Pokemon fan, but unlike the ones that ended up in the original designs, I feel like the inspiration bled through a little too much to not take note of. And like Mega Pidgeot, it's a normal type. Foxicle has basically the same face as Alolan Ninetales and has other similar design elements, with a touch of Glaceon in there. And like both of those Pokemon, it's also an ice type. There's a lot of ways to make a Thundercloud creature, so the fact that Dazi has the same concept and design elements as Thundurus and the same color palette as Shiny Thundurus, it's hard to say it wasn't inspired. And they're also both electric types. Digtoys has a very similar concept to Dreadnought and also borrows elements from Caracosta and Torkoal. The execution is pretty different, but I feel like it's hard to deny that it's inspired by Pokemon's turtles. Tombat looks a lot like Meowscarada, and this is the first in a few entries that are a little iffy for me in terms of including them in these lists. Scarlet and Violet came out at the end of 2022, and Palworld was released in early 2024. While that's plenty of time to make inspired, or in some case stolen, designs and models, from what I can find, Palworld was originally planned to be released in 2022 as well, but it was delayed and already in development for a few years at that point. I don't know when in the development process of Palworld the designs and 3D models were made, and normally I'd assume it pretty early on. All things considered though, I decided these were too similar not to mention, and the same goes for any other Paldean Pokemon I bring up. Bushi is a strange one. It looks very similar to another Decidueye knockoff, which we'll get to later, don't worry, but more specifically it looks like Hisui and Decidueye. It doesn't look like it as much as the other Pal, which is why this one is here in the inspired section. Beacon has the distinct Silvally shape on his head, but has a lot of other different features. Because of how unique that shape is though, I have a hard time saying it's a coincidence. Catris is like a mashup of Mismagius, Glameow, and Sneasel or Weavile. And like Sneasel and Weavile, it's also a dark type. Sibylix has design elements from Frostmoths with shapes of Hatterene, and it's also an ice type like Frostmoth. Kelpsy is mostly an original design, but the face is way too similar to Dragonair for me to ignore. Blazehowl's face and ears are nearly identical to Arcanine, and they're also both fire types. Patalia has elements from Blossom, Kirlia, and Serena, but doesn't feel like a ripoff. And it's also a grass type like two of those inspirations. King Paka has elements of Hisuian Growlithe and Cantonian Arcanine, as well as a chest design prominent in Pokemon like Empoleon, but shows up in a few others like Licky Licky. Wumpo is like a Snover with a Tangela or Shelter face, and like how Snover is a grass ice type, Wumpo has two forms that are ice and grass respectively. Quivern has elements undeniably similar to Gardevoir and Pokemon like Absol and Delibird, but to me reads as original otherwise. I think it's fair to compare Hailzephyr to Hisuian Bravery, especially its shiny, and Unpheasant with a bit of Chandelure. Generally though, it feels pretty different from a Pokemon. I don't think Anubis would look like Lucario as much as it does if the game had a more original art style, but since Lucario and Anubis draw from the same inspirations, Anubis is stylized in a way that looks a lot like Lucario. Jormuntide looks like if you made Gyarados more detailed, and its second form looks like shiny Gyarados. This is another instance of being a lot of ways to stylize something like an Eastern Dragon, and yet going in a similar design direction. It ended up looking a little too similar to Gyarados to say that it wasn't an inspiration, even if the end result is a little different. It also has the water type in common with Gyarados. Suzaku has elements of Scizor and Blaziken with the eyes of Rayquaza. And lastly, Grisbolt has design similarities to Electabuzz, Gengar, and Zangoose. The claws are also similar to Pokemon like Combusken and Ursaring, and that's a common way for Pokemon to stylize claws. And like Electabuzz, it's an electric type. Out of all 111 pals, there were 29 I felt were inspired by Pokemon while still being original enough to stand on their own. And like the pals in the previous section, I would have much preferred to see these designs in a more original art style, because even though a lot of these take inspiration in a fair way, they still feel like they're stealing because they're trying so hard to look like a Pokemon. Now, the reason you're probably all here: the stolen designs. I'll start by saying, if you think you've seen these all, I'd still highly recommend you watch this section. As someone who has seen some of the worst examples of theft online since this whole debate started, I didn't realize just how bad it was until I looked through all the pals myself. The criteria for these were simple, but in a few different categories. There's the copies that essentially Frankenstein a few different Pokemon together. There's the copies that look like when I would go to the flea market and find Pocket Pals the game, and now with playing cards. Basically a knockoff through and through, even if the models themselves are different. And worst of all, there's the copies where the models were heavily referenced or directly traced over. there's also a lot here, so I'm gonna try and get through this as fast as I can. Let's get into it. Lamball and Wooloo are the same, they're even the same type. Cativa is like a bipedal recolored Zora with Minccino hair. Going through these pals, some like Liftmonk felt like they rode the line of inspiration and theft, but unlike the ones that ended up in the inspired section, this one I felt was way too similar to get away with it. It's like a combo of Leafeon and Pachirisu with a hint of Lilligant. The tail also looks so much like Thievul's tail, and like two of those Pokemon, it's a grass type. Not only is Sparket's stance very similar to Raichu, it also has its tail while taking things from Ampharos and Electabuzz. It's also an electric type. If you take Pansage and give it Luxio or Luxray ears with a hint of Ogerpon, you get Tansy. And like two of those Pokemon, it's a grass type. Pangolett is a Piplup with a Psyduck body. It's also a water type. I debated if Pecking belonged in this section, but since it doesn't change much from Pangolett, which we've established is a Piplup with a Psyduck body, and it also has an Apollyon Bonaparte flare like Empoleon, in the end I decided it belonged here. I can see someone arguing in its defense, and I feel like out of all of the ones in this section, it's the least stolen, but the similarities were too strong. There's also slight hints of Manaphy that I would normally ignore, but all things considered, I figured it was worth mentioning. And just like every single one of those Pokemon, it's also a water type. Everyone is talking about how Joltog is a Shaman that went Super Saiyan, but I haven't seen anyone talk about how its alternate form also has the back of a Alolan Sandslash, which is also an ice type. At first glance, T-Fant looked more like an inspired or original design, but it resembles Munna and Cufant a lot with a Litleo tail. From its regular to its shiny to its Gigantamax form to its typing, Cremis is Eevee. I was gonna put Daydream in the original section, but then I realized that's Weavile's face. It also has the same body color and is a dark type. It's kind of like they just fucked up a Weavile a little bit. Nox is a combo of Eevee and Glaceon, specifically different variants of Glaceon from spin-off games like Pokemon Go and plushies made by the Pokemon Company. Kilmari is if Inkay cosplayed as an Esper. Inkay and Kilmari are also both dark types. Dire Howl is Lycanroc. And I mean that literally, they traced a 3D model. At first, Floppy reads like an original, or at least an inspired design, but the more you look at it, the more you realize it's a combination of a bunch of Pokemon. I think the most obvious is the Tinkaton hair, but there's also the Rowlet grass bow tie, Grookey arms, and ears prominent in Pokemon like Stoutland. And like two of those Pokemon, it's a grass type. Hangyu is long Chingling with a Hoppip face. Woolip is a combination of Alchemy, Mareep, specifically Shiny Mareep, and a hint of Clefairy. Melpaka is Flaffy mixed with Sylveon. Nightwing is another Frankenstein Pokemon. Corviknight is the base with the wings of its pre-evolution Corvisquire, and then it also takes from Braviary and Staraptor with the face of Kommo-o. Emolga plus Sylveon equals Rabunny. Incineram is one of a few Zoroark clones with some Houndoom and Lucario thrown in for some good measure. Like Zoroark and Houndoom, it's also a dark type, and its alternate even looks like Zoroark's shiny version. Somehow completely missed this when I was reading my script, but Demud is a Clodsire and a Sobble with Stunfisk eyes. Loopmoon is Zoroark with some Absol and is a dark type like both of them. Robinquill is Decidueye mixed with Blaziken, and the alternate version looks like Hisui in Decidueye. Unsurprisingly, it's also a grass type. Gorarat is Luxray crossed with Grafaiai. For as many people pointing out how Grintel's face is a direct rip from Galarian Meowth, there's not enough people mentioning the herdier aspect of it. I think Chilette's design is fairly distinct from Furret despite being very obviously Pokemon inspired, but the model and stance is way too similar for Furret for me to say it wasn't stolen. This was kind of the similar issue I had with the Drillbur inspired pal from before, but for some reason this one feels especially like Furret to me. And if you disagree with me putting this one here, or if you disagreed with me putting the Drillbur inspired one in the inspired section, just think of each section representing this type of Pokemon. I mean pal. Shit. Rayhound looks like a fusion of Lucario, specifically the Shiny and Boltund, and is an electric type. Dinossum is a Dragonite base with Meganium and Lilligant pieces, and its alternate version looks like Shiny Meganium. Its first form is Grass type like Meganium and Lilligant, and both forms are Dragon type like Dragonite. The people at Pocket Pair wanted to fuck Salazzle so bad, they traced its model and made Lavander, which from my understanding will have sex with you. I would put Wixen in the inspired section due to its similarities to Delphox, but what it didn't steal from Delphox itself directly stole from Pyra 98's fan version of Mega Delphox. We'll talk about this more later, but one thing people say in defense of Palworld is that they're stealing from a billion-dollar company and not a small company or individual. And to that I say, What about this? This is incredibly blatant theft from an independent artist. What defense is there for this? Berdache is possibly the most infamous of all the stolen pals. This is Cinderace with a sprinkle of Pansage. It's also a grass type like Pansage. Alphadren is recolored Ampharos with wings. Azurode is a superior base with Suicune embellishments and is a water type like Suicune. The back of its head also reminds me of Primarina, who, funnily enough, is another water type. Relaxaurus is Goodra's body with Quagsire's face and colors, and its alternate form also resembles Ampharos and has Toxtricity's electricity. Its first form is a water type like Quagsire, and its second form is electric type like Toxtricity, and both forms are dragon type like Goodra. Broncherry is an interesting one because its first form very obviously has elements from Meganium, Bayleaf, and Lilligant with a hint of superior and eyes that are common in Pokemon like Frostmoth. It's even a grass type like nearly all of those Pokemon. Then when you look at its alternate form, it's the most Aurorus knockoff an Aurorus knockoff can get. Mammorest is a grassy Donphan. Warsect looks like Mega Aggron and Mega Heracross with patterns that remind you of the Hoenn box art legendaries. Fenglope is the Cobalion your mom says you have at home. It turns out we also have Darkrai at home called Felbat. Astagon looks even more like Mega Aggron than Warsect, but also resembles regular Aggron a lot. Menasting is so close to being an original design, but has the oh so very distinct Giratina / Arceus face that there's no way I can call it original. Lilene is a Mega Gardevoir mixed with Lilligant with a touch of Blossom. It's also a grass type. Its alternate form also reminds me so much of Lunala, and while it's just the color palette, I thought I'd mention it anyways, since the original form was already stolen. If you thought you saw a Corviknight clone before, wait until you see Phalaris. Orzhow's body and face is almost one-to-one Garchomp with the same Toxtricity electricity. It also shares types with both of them being electric and dragon. Shadowbeak is a cross of Typenol and Silvally with Arceus details. Palladius and Chromis looked more like inspired designs at first because of their resemblance to Armarouge and Ceruledge, and maybe a hint of Mega Gallade, but the more I looked at them, the more they're the same. And the fact that these two look to be counterparts to each other like Armarouge and Ceruledge definitely doesn't help their case. Frostallion looks like Suicune and Glastrier, and its alternate form not only makes the Suicune aspects more obvious, but also resembles Glastrier's counterpart Spectrier. It definitely looks more like Glastrier than Spectrier, but the fact that these two counterparts can be seen in both of this pal's forms is definitely something to take note of. Tetragron reads mostly as Salamence, but there's also elements from Garchomp and Iron Jugulus, and has limb shapes common in Pokemon like Chespin and Zoroark. There's two pals that I'm unclear if they're in the game or not, but I don't think it really matters because they made this list anyways. Boltbane is Luxray. You can't say it's not. And while I couldn't find a full body image of Dragastrophe, from what I can see, it looks like a fusion of Zoroark, Reshiram, and Zekrom. Now, I want to remind you that, in my personal opinion, there were 31 original designs and 29 inspired designs. When you count the last two pals that may or may not be in the game, want to know how many were stolen? 52. 52. That's nearly half of the pals in the game. If we put all of these numbers into percentages and round to the nearest whole number, that's 27% original designs, 26% Pokemon-inspired designs, and 46 stolen designs. In my opinion, plagiarism is bad. Period. And also, in my opinion, about half of the pals are plagiarized, whether it's the design, the 3D models, or both. But despite this, there are people who will admit that they're stolen, but are completely fine with it since Pokemon is a billion-dollar company. And while I see the point they're making, I don't think this is a good example of that at all. I remember one post specifically talking about how people will say, eat the rich, and then get upset that a company as big as Pokemon was stolen from. Correct me if I'm wrong, but eat the rich is more about holding rich people and corporations accountable publicly if they did something morally wrong, or legally if they broke the law. And both things happen a lot, and they get away with it. I thought it was more about taxing rich people more, because I still remember the year Donald Trump revealed how much he paid in taxes, and it was only about $100 more than I did. I thought it was more about encouraging people to buy from small businesses because they're much more likely to have the consumer's needs and interests at heart compared to rich people who just want to sell you something. And if you want to be more kind about it, I thought it was about encouraging rich people to donate to charities because a billionaire could donate $1 million and still keep their billionaire status. When it comes to physically stealing something from a corporation. This isn't a case of, say, someone shoplifting from Target. And if we take it to creative fields, I don't even think it's the same as an artist selling prints they made of an anime or video game character. This isn't an independent artist selling a drawing they made of a Pokemon to maybe make a few $100s off of it. This is a company that sold about 7 million copies of a game with various stolen assets. This isn't a case of eating the rich. This is a case of a company taking from another company to sell you a product. That's it. And believe it or not, this difference does make a difference in copyright laws. At the end of the day, the copyright holder holds the rights to their work. So from the artist alley / con approach, a company like Pokemon could take legal action against someone if they're selling Pokemon merch. But there's a reason most of the time companies don't. A part of copyright law people don't know as much about is the impact the use of copyrighted material has on the original work and the creator. Even if there's use of a copyrighted character, I promise you, the Pokemon Company isn't losing anything from an independent artist selling a handful of art prints or acrylic charms, and they know that. Reputation aside, they know it's absolutely not worth it to go after anyone selling a few Pokemon prints or charms. Now let's take a look at Palworld. If you watch me go through the list of stolen designs and still think I haven't stolen from the Pokemon Company, you're in denial. Seeing as some parts of Pokemon were directly traced over, there's certainly a case of plagiarism to be made. Now consider the 7 million copies sold of Palworld for about $28 each. I don't know how much Paldworld cost to make, so I don't know exactly how much Pocket Pair has made off of it, but I think it's safe to say it's more than a few $100s. Not only that, but there's a number of people who are gravitating towards Paldworld because they don't like the Pokemon Company. One of the reasons YouTubers can't use copyrighted songs in their videos is because of the argument, well, people could go to your video to listen to the song instead of supporting the artist directly. Do you see what I'm getting at here? In my opinion, there's certainly a legal case to be made, so now there's just the question of will they? Personally, I don't think so, at least at the moment. There's a lot of things to consider. One of the things, like I mentioned earlier, is reputation. Palworld might be selling a lot of copies, and I mean millions of copies, but the Pokemon Company is still a much larger company than Pocket Pair. And seeing the amount of people speaking badly about Pokemon and Nintendo since the release of Palworld, I know, and the Pokemon Company probably knows, that those thoughts would only be furthered if they pursued a lawsuit against Pocket Pair. And there's also the Pokemon mod to take into consideration. In case you're unaware, there was already a Pokemon mod made for Palworld that replaces the character model with Ash Ketchum and the Pals replaced with Pokemon, and it was taken down by Nintendo almost immediately. I can see them pursuing a case in the future if Palworld continues to steal assets from Pokemon, and if Nintendo does pursue a case, I can't say I blame them, especially when you consider Pocket Pair as a company. Before Palworld, Pocket Pair made a little game called Craftopia, and it's Breath of the Wild. Going through that game is a completely different topic, so look into that yourself if you're interested, but this is definitely worth mentioning because this shows a pattern of repeated theft. Also, this doesn't have much to do with anything, but it was really important to me to mention that, according to WindowsCentral.com, they considered adding NFTs to Craftopia. I think that says a lot about them as a company. They're also currently developing a game called Nevergrave. Visually, it's strikingly similar to Hollow Knight. Personally, I don't know much about Hollow Knight, so it's hard for me to say if they've stolen anything directly, especially when you consider that the game isn't out yet to my knowledge. But Hollow Knight fans, you can definitely let me know your thoughts. The other most notable game they made— oh god. Well, I made an entirely separate video about AI image generators, specifically with art, and even though that video is about a year old, it's just as, if not more relevant than before. I'd definitely appreciated it if you checked it out after this video, but seeing as that video is an hour and a half long, I get it if you don't want to jump into another long one. So for now, I'll summarize the main points. Not only is there no way to filter out copyrighted materials in AI generators, but there's also no way for artists, or anyone really, to opt out of having their images used to train models, meaning copyrighted materials and artist work are being used without permission and compensation. They steal from artists, people have made AI models to replicate specific artists' work, and they've only continued to take opportunities away from artists since that video. Marvel used it for an opening sequence instead of hiring animators. Recently Wacom, you know, The drawing tablet company used AI images to promote their tablet, and I've even seen creators on social media use AI images instead of working with artists. I recently switched video editing programs because the previous one I used implemented an image generator instead of working with artists like they have before, and so much more. Even though the more you get into it, the more you realize it violates copyright laws, unfortunately, the laws themselves haven't caught up to technology yet. Although that said, the one law that does exist is that you can't copyright AI generated work. What's more, something we learned after the making of that video is that they're also really bad for the environment. So regardless of what this game is about, I'm already very against it based on the use of AI alone. Let's take a look at how to play anyways. You and a group of friends are given a theme for an art exhibition except for one of you. You all have to use those prompts to make pieces for the exhibit, but there is the imposter who has to make drawings without knowing what the theme is. You have to figure out who the imposter is, and that's it. That's the game. I honestly have no idea how this game works in practice, since you make AI images by typing in prompts and the computer spits something out. It would work well as an actual drawing game, since you'd all presumably be working on a time limit, and the imposter would have to look around at other people's work to try and figure out what they're drawing. You wouldn't even have to be good at art for it to work, since I'd imagine perfectly rendered images would make it very easy to spot who didn't follow the prompts versus hastily drawn scribbles. Then you could get into debates and make things up on the fly for the imposter as you try to convince everyone that you actually drew something else, and it sounds like a fun concept. Unfortunately, the people at Pocket Pair don't seem to have a creative bone in their body, so of course they went the stealing from artists route. I know it seems like I went on a bit of a tangent here, and maybe I did get a bit distracted, but I promise I'm talking about AI at length for a reason. There's been some speculation that AI was actually used to create the PALWORLD designs, and that's why they look so much like Pokemon. AI doesn't care about copyright, so it would make sense. There have been instances before where an AI generator will spit out a supposedly original image, but it looks strikingly similar to something an artist has created, so it's definitely possible that it could do that with Pokemon designs. Pocket Pair also made an entire game about AI image generators, so it doesn't seem like a far-fetched theory. The main thing that goes against that is that Steam requires publishers to indicate if AI was used to make their game, and the PALWORLD page on Steam doesn't mention the use of AI at all. This doesn't necessarily mean that they haven't used AI in the making of PALWORLD, and given the fact that they plagiarized designs for about half of their creature designs, I don't think they care too much about playing by the rules. Another article I found thinks that the use of AI is unlikely, and it links to a Twitter thread where a user took the 3D models of the Pokemon people think were used and compared them to their PALWORLD copies. The consensus seems to be that they weren't copied and pasted, but rather either traced over or replicated as closely as possible without tracing. Kind of like you're trying to draw Saliza like one of your French girls. So basically, the shapes and dimensions and polylines, polygons, I don't know anything about 3D modeling, but the shapes and the dimensions and the proportions are basically the same, but there are very slight differences that indicate they aren't copied and pasted, but rather they are traced over by hand or heavily referenced and trying to make as close of a copy as possible by hand without directly tracing it. Personally, I don't think this completely disproves the use of AI, excluding ones like the Lycanroc clone that were very clearly just traced over and made to be slightly different from the original Pokemon. Even the ones that don't have models that were completely traced or heavily referenced, it's entirely possible that an image generator was used to create the designs and then the models were created based on that. Even aside from Pocket Pair's AI game, one of the devs has been a huge defender of AI image generators and was even amazed by AI's ability to make Pokemon. How about that, huh? As far as I know, the people at Pocket Pair haven't commented on the concept of them using AI for their designs, and the use of AI in PALWORLD is pure speculation. And seeing as their interviews are all in Japanese, a language I do not speak, it's also possible that I just missed it, so if anyone else knows anything, or if anything else comes to light after I post this video, feel free to let me know. Before I move on, I want to say, I always think it's hilarious when AI lovers are like, you can't even tell which one is AI, the future is here! And then this is the AI in question. I promise you, we can tell. One of the most frustrating parts about this discourse, for a number of reasons, is how PALWORLD fans water it down to being Nintendo bootlickers and dick riders. First and foremost, no one hates Nintendo more than Nintendo fans. Or more specifically, no one hates the Pokemon Company more than Pokemon fans. Secondly, for some reason, people are acting like we can't criticize PALWORLD and the Pokemon Company. They're not mutually exclusive. I, for one, am very critical of Nintendo and the Pokemon Company. My criticisms can be small things like rushing games for the sake of meeting a deadline, or changing the controls slightly every game, which actually drives me insane. They're literally the same functions. Why do they need to be changed? And my criticisms can also be larger things, like how they're very against Pokemon emulators while not making the older games available in any capacity, and their refusal to pay for better graphics, animations, and even the smallest bit of voice acting, despite 100% being able to afford it. I don't have time to go over each and every little debate and controversy and discussion that there is to have about the Pokemon Company, but the point that I'm making is, you can be critical of both things, even if you are a Pokemon fan. Call me crazy, but I think plagiarism is bad. Period. And after looking over all of the creatures in Palworld, there are a lot of designs in Palworld that plagiarized Pokemon. If they plagiarized Digimon designs, Yu-Gi-Oh designs, or literally any designs other than Pokemon, I'd be just as critical of Palworld. And I have never consumed a piece of Yu-Gi-Oh or Digimon media in my life. Let's take one of my least favorite people, J.K. Rowling. Not only is she terrible, but I have not consumed or plan to consume anything Harry Potter related. I have never once been a fan. If someone were selling a book series that was nearly 50% copy and pasted text from Harry Potter, I would not buy that book, and I would hope she would take legal action against them so they could no longer sell that book. Maybe it's because I'm an artist and a writer that I take plagiarism so seriously, especially as someone who has had their work stolen before. But first and foremost, there's the principle of it all. Nobody should be able to get away with plagiarism. People should be paid and recognized for their work if their work is being sold, and people who sell something they copied from someone else should be held accountable. But I think specifically when it comes to artists, people often equate laws and morals. I'm not a lawyer, but I know there's some nuance with legality in situations like Palworld. And that said, even if what they're doing is technically legal and technically is covered by copyright laws, this is a completely reasonable thing to be upset about, and we should be upset about it. I know Pokemon is a large corporation, but the people designing these Pokemon are artists that worked very hard to make them. Markiplier is so much more popular than I am, believe it or not. But imagine if half of this video was a re-upload of one of his videos where the only things I changed was mirroring it and putting a colorful filter over it. Then I get 7 million views and people were like, wow, great job on the video. Markiplier is infinitely more popular than I am and certainly makes more money than I do, but people would be like, hey, that's Markiplier's video, you can't do that. And I think the same logic can be applied here. Then there's the second issue of, why do I want to buy a copy? I agree that complete originality doesn't exist. If you make something, I can basically guarantee something else exists that's like it. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. I've had characters and stories I made get compared to other pieces of media, but not only is that not almost half of my work, but even in instances where people could tell I was inspired by something, they still recognized it as its own thing because I would take it in its own direction, in my own style, both in art and writing. There's absolutely nothing wrong with being inspired by something, and it's not even a bad thing for those inspirations to be obvious. Even the designs that were inspired by Pokemon would be completely fine to have in-game, but because of the massive amounts of other designs that were stolen, even the ones that were only inspired still feel like cheap copies. I promise we'll talk about the gameplay soon, but even though it plays pretty different from a Pokemon game, it's hard to see it as anything other than Pokemon with guns because nearly half of the creature designs are stolen and about a third are inspired by Pokemon, all while nearly all of them are leaning hard into the Pokemon art style. Some of the pals are just Pokemon, and as a creator, that's not what you want. If you haven't noticed it earlier, most of the Pokemon that were copied into Palworld are some of the most popular Pokemon ever, and I can promise you that's not a coincidence. By doing that, you're basically sabotaging yourself because this thing you're working hard on will never stand on its own or be viewed as its own property. It's only ever going to be compared to the thing people are more familiar with. And as a consumer, I don't want to buy something if it reads as a clone of this other thing. I want something new and interesting, and Palworld could have been that, but instead of leaning into the good original ideas it has, it's leaning into the other direction of piggybacking on something more popular. I think these are all reasonable things to think, but for some reason, people are almost desperate to paint Pokemon fans in a bad light. IGN made an article about the criticisms Palworld has gotten, and they included screenshots of people's posts without their usernames censored. I know other companies do the same thing, but I promise I'm bringing this up for a reason. And then after this, IGN also made an article talking about how the Palworld devs have gotten death threats in the midst of all this. Immediately I'll say, and it's crazy I have to say this, anyone who sent death threats to the Palworld devs should be more than ashamed of themselves. Actions like those are things I have never agreed with, and will never stand by. To put it lightly, it's unnecessary, and to put it bluntly, it's disgusting. That said, it's awfully ironic that IGN wrote an article about how Pokemon fans have sent these threats, yet have remained silent on the death threats users have gotten as a result of the first IGN article I mentioned. I really don't feel comfortable showing screenshots of the posts people have made talking about their death threats as a result of this IGN article, since showing posts and usernames is what led to death threats to begin with, and I would hate to have contributed to that in any way. But if you don't believe me, you can probably find them for yourselves, assuming those posts haven't been deleted. And I won't deny, there's been some questionable Pokemon fans. And with situations like this, bad people like that will always pop up. But the fact is, the people defending Palworld have been just as bad. And I think all things considered, whether it's Palworld blatant theft or the behavior of Palworld fans, I think it's unfair to label the Pokemon community as toxic, because let's be honest, everyone in this situation is a little toxic. So, if we ignore the PAL's designs, how similar is Palworld to Pokemon? I haven't played Palworld myself, and to be completely honest, I don't ever plan on it. All of the knowledge I have of Palworld's gameplay comes from Austin John's video, which very conveniently came out while I was scripting this. I definitely wasn't going to buy the game, and I wasn't looking forward to finding footage of gameplay from some random person on the internet I didn't know, so a breakdown of the gameplay from someone who's reputable in the gaming community was certainly helpful. Definitely check out his video if you want to hear more about how the game plays, as well as see it in action, but I'll start by saying what is similar to Pokemon. You catch creatures and get materials either by catching or defeating wild pals by using your own pals and absolutely nothing else, and you can use these materials to craft stuff. There's also a breeding mechanic for pals, and it also features legendary pals and alpha pals, which is apparently the terminology they use. Aside from the more mature angle, the main difference, in my opinion, is that the pals aren't the point of the game, for a lack of better way of putting it. In Pokemon, you catch them, become friends, and go on an adventure together. There's also the obvious catch-em-all angle in Pokemon. In Palworld, the main function of them is to maintain a base camp that you set up, and it seems like the focus is more on catching the ones that are more helpful to you for whatever it is you're trying to achieve, versus Pokemon, where part of the appeal is having a full collection, even the ones that you don't really like that much. You can definitely use them in battle and travel with them, but since it's a survival game, it's pretty goalless, and it seems like there's much less of a bond formed between the player and their pals when compared to a player and their Pokemon. I think the main difference between Palworld and other monster catching games is the survival aspect of it, since other monster catching games tend to be more story based. Speaking of monster catching games, another thing I don't like about what the discourse has become is how a number of people who enjoy Palworld make it seem like Pokemon fans are upset that it's another monster catching game, period, which is just blatantly false. Monster catching and monster taming games have been around for a long time, and it's not a genre exclusive to Pokemon at all. From ones that have faded away more over time, like Monster Rancher, to ones that are still popular today, like Digimon, people aren't upset at the fact that Palworld is a monster tamer. And since Digimon is also another popular monster catching and monster taming game, I think it's the perfect example to use for this. Let's take a look at some Pokemon designs and some Digimon designs. Digimon is a great example of how a creature design can have similar inspirations, shapes, colors, and even all three at once while still reading as its own individual design. So much so that Digimon is still around. There's even some instances like this in Palworld with the Firefox pal, and situations like that only make me more frustrated at the theft. One argument I've seen is Pokemon fans should be happy it's popular because it'll push Pokemon to be better, and I strongly disagree. If Pokemon gets pushed to be better, it should be from a game that's original and unique, something that takes risks with great payoffs and things like that, not because people are playing a game that has ripoffs of their designs. Whether it's the Pokemon company or any other game company, what does this actually show? People don't care about ethical creation. Theft is fine, from a big company to a fan artist online. I don't know why people are acting like the issue is Pokemon fans want Pokemon to stay on top, because truth be told, I don't think a single Pokemon fan has ever mentioned something like that during all of this. Because something that we all know is, you can still like something that isn't the #1 most popular thing. If something ever ups Pokemon and being the best-selling franchise, I can still enjoy playing Pokemon games. It's literally fine. When I was watching Austin John's video, he said they could update the game and replace all of the pals with new designs, and he'd still play the game because he enjoyed it. And honestly, I think that's a great idea. In case I haven't made it clear enough, the only thing people really complain about is the theft of Pokemon designs. It's not the concept of a monster catching and monster taming game, it's not the gameplay gameplay, it's just the Pokemon designs. And it's frustrating to see that people are ignoring that because of their own personal views of Nintendo and the Pokemon Company. I personally would have no issue with Palworld as a game, assuming they didn't use AI, if they hadn't stolen another game's designs. And I know that statement is true for a lot of people. Most people, in fact. But unfortunately, I don't think Palworld is a game I could ever support, or more specifically, Pocket Pair is a company I could never support. As if the plagiarism throughout multiple games wasn't enough, the fact that they made an AI art game, possibly used it in Palworld, and even considered adding NFTs to the game, I can't ever buy a product of theirs with a sound mind. If I can say anything about them though, they were at least smart enough to not steal Charizard. I'd like to give a quick thank you to all of my patrons for helping make this video possible, especially my tiers 3 and 4 members. Big shout out to SemiBear127, The Tiny Artist, Nyoko Arts, Sage Rosado, Isla, It's Dorky Arts, Castle Roodle, Anna, Hikaru, Jamie, Jadios, Creatively Anxious, Dazzy Bones, Michael Sasha Rose, Red Boots the Time Traveler, Lauka2, Clementine Jam, Jay Johnson, Vivi Martin, Bread, Fantastic Artist, Newly D, Joss, Ravern, Gravity Drop, Blue, Blue Devil 4, Shara Amy, Sunset Lemonade, Corvid Dom, Kyron, Leia, Tina K, Donna Fangirl, Oswin, Sammy the Boy Draws, Caden, Edward Kingston, Anime Fan 110, Uinamon, Xfacat, Art Iconics, Damaged Coda, Deanna Riano, Yudo, Boo, Lex, Snapdragon Fern, Nestbones, Gardo 5, Dustnook Arts, Nishi Studios, Star Sailor, Zucchini Bread, Fog Scorpio, XXX Art Lover, Max D. Wellington, Amarix, Cade, Obnoxious Avian, Tay, and Annabelle. Thank you all so much for the extra support. It really means a lot to me. And if you're interested in becoming a part of my Patreon, you can find the link in the description box below. When I first decided I wanted to make a video about Palworld, I was like, oh, this will be a fun little thing to do real quick. And then it turns out I had a lot to say about it, so this ended up being a longer video than I thought it would be, but I hope you enjoyed it. Also, if you made it this far, you'll probably remember how throughout the video I mentioned that I am an artist and a writer. And if that was interesting to you at all, you should check out my webcomic. Chapter 1 has been out for a while, and I had to stop working on it due to my cat getting sick, but I've been back at it, and Chapter 2 is coming along very nicely, and I'm looking to release it in the next month or so, but I will definitely let you guys know when there's a more concrete release date. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. Feel free to let me know your thoughts and opinions on Palworld, or just tell me how your day's going, whatever you want to do. But yeah, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I will hopefully see you in the next one. Bye.